The sun hung at its zenith over the northern New Mexico Territory prairie, a merciless white eye that had burned the land for 3 months without meaningful rain. Late summer of 1873 was a season of dust and desperation, where the earth cracked into geometric patterns and the air tasted of alkali and dying hope. Heat shimmered off the flats in waves that made the distant red-banded cliffs waver like something out of a fever dream. And the brittle grass rattled in the hot wind with a sound like old bones being shaken in a leather bag. 3 figures occupied a frozen tableau beneath those ancient cliffs, their shadows pooling dark and sharp on the pale earth. A Cheyenne warrior stood with arms folded across his chest, his fringed buckskin shirt dark with sweat, a single eagle feather bound into black hair that fell past his shoulders. His name was Enepai, and his face bore the weathered calm of a man who had learned to read danger in the smallest shifts of wind or shadow. Behind him, a paint horse grazed beside a smaller bay mare, both animals drowsing in the heat with their tails flicking lazily at flies. Kneeling in the dust was a young woman in a torn traveling dress of faded blue calico, her auburn hair escaping from pins that had long since failed their purpose. Cordelia Hirsch was 24 years old, though frontier hardship had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth that aged her beyond those years. Her hands resting protectively on a scuffed leather valise bore calluses across the palms, the unmistakable marks of someone who had pulled survey chains and driven grade stakes into resistant earth for 2 years, while pretending to be a young man named Cord. Standing over her finger, jabbing the air like a weapon aimed at her heart, was Otto Hirsch. The man's sun-cured coat hung loose on a frame that had once been broader, his face lined and gray with the particular exhaustion of a gambler who had lost more than he could afford, and was now staking his last possession, his daughter, on a desperate hand. The Remington revolver on his hip gleamed with recent oil, the only possession he maintained with any care, because a man on the frontier could lose everything but his ability to protect himself or to threaten others. "Stand up, girl." Otto's voice cracked on the words equal parts authority and desperation, the tone of a man trying to convince himself, as much as anyone else, that he still had power here. "You're coming back with me. This foolishness ends now. You hear me, it ends." Cordelia's fingers tightened on the valise. Inside were rolled survey papers covered in her own precise ink lines, maps showing elevations grades, and most importantly, the underground architecture of artesian aquifers that could transform this dust bowl into viable farmland. Water in a land where water meant the difference between life and death, between prosperity and ruin. Otto's other hand hovered over the valise lid as if it were a coiled snake that might strike his knuckles white with the pressure of restraint. Enepai did not move, but his dark eyes tracked the horizon where 2 riders had appeared cresting a low rise to the north. Hired guns, by the way. They sat their saddles loose and confident rifles held ready across their laps, men who had been paid to do violence, and would do it without particular malice or hesitation. The wind carried their voices too distant to make out words, but close enough to hear laughter. Men who found sport in what they did. Cordelia looked up at her father, then past him to the approaching riders, and felt her breath catch in her throat like a trapped bird. Her pulse hammered in her ears. This was the moment. Everything she had worked for, endured for, suffered for 2 years of binding her breasts and lowering her voice and moving through the world as someone she was not all to earn wages that the coverture laws would have otherwise given to the man standing over her. Now came down to this scorching afternoon and the words she had spoken an hour earlier at the freight depot in Red Butte. Words that had shocked even herself with their audacity. "I am this man's wife." It had been pure calculation, a legal gambit born of desperation. Common law marriage was recognized in the territories through public declaration and cohabitation, though the latter requirement was more flexible in practice than in theory. And a married woman could not be controlled by a father's guardianship claim. The law, such as it was out here on the edge of civilization, provided that narrow protection. But the words had also been a plea, an appeal to the humanity of a stranger, whose sleeve she had grabbed in a moment of pure terror as Deputy Walt Haskins had reached for her with hands that promised captivity and worse. Court Clerk Whitfield testified that the seal on the deed was a crude wax copy. The court compared signatures letter by letter and took sworn statements from the notary, thereby establishing the guardianship papers as forgeries. Enepe had read the situation in a heartbeat. The desperation in her eyes, the guns gathering like storm clouds, the cruelty written plain on Otto's face, and the calculation in Haskins's. And he had nodded once, a movement so slight it might have been a trick of the light. So it is. Two words that had bound them together, two strangers with nothing in common, but a shared enemy and a mutual understanding that sometimes the only choice left was to stand and fight even when the odds were terrible. Now on the open prairie, with the sun beating down and violence gathering like a summer storm, you could smell on the wind but not yet see Deputy Walt Haskins rode up beside Otto. The deputy was a slick man in his 30s, his badge polished bright, and his morals considerably less so, the kind of frontier official who had learned that the law could be twisted to serve those willing to pay for the service. He spat tobacco juice into the dust, the brown stream splattering near Cordelia's knee. "Well, Miss Hirsch, or should I say, Mrs.?" He looked at Enepe with unconcealed contempt, his lip curling. "What exactly are you calling yourself these days, Indian?" "His name is Enepe," Cordelia said, rising to her feet with as much dignity as she could muster. Her legs trembled but held locked at the knees with pure stubborn will. "And I am his wife by declaration and witness. The law recognizes common law marriage in this territory, Deputy. You know that as well as I do. Law also recognizes a father's right to protect his daughter when she's proven herself mentally unsound." Haskins pulled a folded document from his coat with the flourish of a stage magician, producing a dove. "I have here a petition for guardianship, signed and sealed proper by the county clerk, giving Otto Hirsch full legal control of your person and property. On account of your documented history of delusions, your refusal to accept feminine propriety, and your recent irrational behavior in contracting a sham marriage to evade lawful authority." "I'm not insane," Cordelia said, but even to her own ears her voice sounded thin, reedy. The heat was making her dizzy, or perhaps it was fear. "And that document is a forgery purchased with Elias Barrage's money to steal my work and sell me like livestock. That's quite an accusation." Haskins' smile was a razor slash across his sunburned face. "Got any proof, or just the hysterical ravings of a woman who can't accept her proper place?" Cordelia's hand moved, before she could think better of it, reaching into her bodice, where she had tucked the letter she had stolen from her father's coat 2 days earlier. The letter that outlined the entire conspiracy in Otto's own cramped, guilty handwriting. But before she could produce it, Haskins's hand dropped to his revolver. "I wouldn't do that, Miss Hirsch. Sudden movements make me nervous, and when I get nervous, my trigger finger gets itchy." Enepe shifted half a step, placing himself more squarely between Cordelia and the deputy, his hand moving to the Spencer, repeating carbine in its scabbard on his saddle. Not drawing, not yet, but making his intent clear as glass. "She stays with me." "That's so." Haskins's eyes narrowed. "You prepared to die for a woman you just met. That's mighty noble of you, Indian. Also mighty stupid." "Stupidity would be assuming I'll go down alone." Enepe's voice was level conversational, but there was something underneath it that made the hired guns exchange glances. This was not a man who bluffed. Otto found his voice thin and pleading. "Cordelia, please. Be reasonable. Mr. Barrage is a wealthy man, a respectable man. He's offering to take care of you, to give you a good life. All he wants is the survey work you had no right to do in the first place, pretending to be something you're not. Come back with me, and we'll sort this out proper with the circuit judge when he arrives tomorrow. Sort it out. Cordelia's voice cracked, and she felt tears of rage and frustration burning behind her eyes. But she blinked them back savagely. She would not cry. Not here. Not now. You mean, sell me to pay your gambling debts? You mean, let Barrage use those maps to file false land claims and steal water from every struggling farmer in the territory? You mean, let him turn public land into his private kingdom while families like Ephraim Pikes watch their children get sick from bad water? Those are just maps, girl. Lines on paper. Otto's voice rose defensive, and she could smell the whiskey on him even from 6 feet away. The sour, sweet reek of a man who had been drinking since breakfast to find courage for this confrontation. They don't belong to you. You drew them on company time with company tools. I drew them with tools I bought with my own wages, on my own time, working jobs I had to pretend to be male to get, because the law says women can't own property or control their own earnings if they have a living father or husband. Cordelia's voice rang out across the prairie, and she felt something crack open inside her, all the years of swallowed rage and suppressed self finally pouring out. I earned every line on those maps. I carried chains in 100-degree heat. I slept on the ground with scorpions. I ate dust and drank alkali water and pretended to be someone I wasn't just so I could do work I was good at. And you lost the money I sent home to keep us fed. You gambled it away, and now you want to sell me like I'm a horse or a plot of land to make up for your failures. The slap caught her across the cheek sharp, and sudden her father's hand moving faster than she would have thought him capable of. Pain exploded across her face, and she staggered sideways, the valise slipping from her grip. Time seemed to slow. She saw Enepe's face transform, saw him move with liquid speed, saw the Spencer come up and level, and heard the metallic click of the hammer being thumbed back. Touch her again, and you die. 4 words spoken with absolute conviction. Haskins drew his revolver. The hired guns brought their rifles around. For one crystalline moment, everyone was frozen in place, all the violence coiled and ready to spring. Cordelia could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the wind rasping through the dead grass, could hear a hawk crying somewhere high above, indifferent to the human drama playing out below. Then Otto Hirsch, showing more intelligence than he had demonstrated in years, stepped back with his hands raised. Now hold on. Nobody needs to die here. Cordelia, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have, but you have to understand. Barrage will kill me if I don't deliver you and those maps. I owe him $1,200. $1,200. Where am I supposed to get that kind of money? That's not my problem. Cordelia's voice was ice. She bent and retrieved the valise, her cheek throbbing, tasting blood, where her teeth had cut the inside of her mouth. You made your choices. Now I'm making mine. She grabbed Enepe's wrist, his skin warm and dry, his pulse steady as a drumbeat beneath her fingers, and met his eyes. In that brief contact, an understanding passed between them that was more profound than words. They could not win a gunfight here, outnumbered 4-1 and exposed on open ground. But they could run, and if they ran together. Enepe saw the calculation in her face and gave the smallest nod. In one fluid motion, he swept the valise from her hands and passed it to her, then grabbed her around the waist and lifted her onto his horse, swinging up behind her in the same movement. His movements were so quick, so practiced, so economically violent, that by the time Haskins realized what was happening and shouted, "Stop them!" they were already wheeling the paint horse away from the group, already kicking it into a gallop. Shoot if you have to. Otto's voice rose to a shriek that cracked in the middle. Just don't hit the valise. Not the valise. Enipe bent low over the horse's neck, pulling Cordelia down with him, and they raced south toward the broken country, where the mesa rose in layers of red and amber stone like a fortress built by geological time. Behind them, shouts erupted. A gunshot cracked across the prairie high and wide, meant to frighten rather than kill, because Haskins knew that a dead woman was no good to Barrage, and a bullet-torn valise might destroy the maps inside. Not yet, anyway. That calculation would change if they got too far away. They plunged into a dry wash, with the horse sliding on loose scree, and Cordelia bit down on a cry as they dropped 6 feet in a heartbeat. The landing jarring her teeth together, hard enough to make her jaw ache. The wash was narrow, barely wider than the horse, its walls eroded into fantastic shapes by flash floods that came perhaps once a year, turning this dead channel into a raging torrent. For a few hours before the water vanished back into the thirsty earth. Enipe guided the horse with his knees, leaving his hands free to work the Spencer's lever action, chambering around with a sound that was both mechanical and somehow organic, like the clicking of a large insect's mandibles. Behind and above them, on the rim of the wash, the pursuers appeared dark silhouettes against the burning sky. Haskins shouted orders, his voice thin with distance. The hired guns split up, 2 riding along each side of the wash, to cut off potential escape routes, while the deputy himself urged his horse down into the wash behind them, his revolver drawn and glinting in the harsh light. How far to cover? Cordelia gasped into Enipe's ear, her arms locked around his waist, feeling the hard muscles of his abdomen tense and release with the horse's rhythm. Canyon mouth. 1/4 mile. His voice was level, controlled, but she could feel his heart hammering against her forearm where it pressed against his chest. Not fear, she realized. Focus. Pure combat focus. When I say jump, you go left into that crack in the wall. Understand? What? No, I won't leave you. You'll do exactly what I tell you, because I know this country and you don't. And if we stay together, we're both dead. His voice was harsh, brooking no argument. Jump left, hide, wait for my signal. Understand? There was no time to argue, no breath to waste on protest. Yes. The wash twisted like a snake's track, each turn blind, each stretch a potential killing ground. Enipe rode with absolute focus, reading the terrain with senses honed by a lifetime of moving through hostile country, seeing patterns in stone and shadow that Cordelia could not even perceive. He saw the split seconds before she did a place where the wash forked the left branch, narrowing to barely 3 feet wide, too tight for a horse, but wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Now. He reined the horse hard, right, while simultaneously shoving Cordelia left, with enough force to send her tumbling from the saddle. She hit the ground hard, rolling the valise clutched to her chest like a shield, and scrambled into the narrow crack as Enipe continued right, drawing the pursuit with him, like a matador drawing a bull. Haskins thundered past the fork without slowing, focused on the horse ahead. But one of the hired guns, a lean man with a scarred face and dead eyes that had seen too much killing, spotted Cordelia's movement. He pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted, drawing a long knife that caught the sun and threw it back in a cold arc of light. Found the girl northeast fork. Cordelia pressed herself against the stone, her breath coming in ragged gasps that seemed impossibly loud in the confined space. The rock walls were hot enough to burn through her dress, radiating stored heat like a bread oven. The hired gun advanced into the narrow space knife, held low and professional. The blade angled up for a gut thrust that would disable without killing immediately, because dead women didn't talk, and Barrage would want to know who else knew about the maps. She looked down at the valise in her hands, mind racing. Not much of a weapon, but inside was her surveyor's steel pin, 10 inches of hardened metal with a point sharp enough to drive through prairie sod, and into the resistant clay beneath. She fumbled the valise open with fingers that felt clumsy and disconnected, found the pin closed her hand around its reassuring solidity. The hired gun was 3 feet away when she struck, driving the pin toward his knife hand, with all the strength born of 2 years hauling survey equipment and absolute terror. The point punched through the back of his hand between the small bones, a sensation like pushing through gristle, and she felt the shock of impact travel up her arm. He screamed a raw animal sound that had nothing human in it, and the knife clattered to the stone. Cordelia shoved past him back out into the main wash where she found chaos. Enepe had circled back and was locked in brutal close-quarters combat with Haskins, the 2 men grappling for control of the deputy's revolver. The gun was between them, pointing skyward, both men's hands wrapped around it with white-knuckled desperation. They staggered together, boots scraping on rock, neither giving ground. The revolver fired. The bullet went straight up harmless, except for the noise, and the concussion so close to Haskins's ear made him flinch. But the shot spooked the horses. The paint reared, breaking free from where Enepe had ground-tied it and bolted back the way they had come. Haskins saw his advantage in Enepe's moment of distraction and drove a knee into the warrior's stomach with brutal precision. Enepe doubled over, breath exploding from his lungs, and the deputy tore the revolver free, bringing it around to aim at Enepe's head. Cordelia threw the surveyor's pin. Her aim was desperate rather than skilled, the pin tumbling end over end, but the blunt end hit Haskins in the temple hard enough to make him flinch. The shot went wide, chipping stone beside Enepe's head and sending fragments flying. One caught him across the hairline, opening a cut that immediately began sheeting blood down the side of his face. Enepe surged up, driving his shoulder into Haskins's chest and slamming the deputy against the wash wall with enough force to crack ribs. The revolver fell from nerveless fingers. Both men dove for it. Enepe got there first, kicking it away into the shadows, then hammered a fist into Haskins's jaw with a sound like an axe hitting green wood. The deputy's head snapped back, cracking against stone, and his eyes rolled white. "Run!" Enepe grabbed Cordelia's hand, and they ran sprinting down the wash as shouts echoed behind them. The canyon mouth loomed ahead, a dark gap in the mesa wall, narrow and promising shadow and labyrinthine complexity that would make pursuit difficult. They plunged into it, the temperature dropping 20 degrees in an instant, as the high walls cut off the sun, and the sudden chill after the furnace heat outside made Cordelia's skin prickle with goose flesh. The canyon twisted and rose, narrowing to barely shoulder width in places where Cordelia had to turn sideways to squeeze through the stone pressing against her from both sides, like the earth itself was trying to hold her back. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter. The hired guns unable to navigate the tight spaces on horseback and too cautious to pursue on foot into terrain. They didn't know where an ambush could come from any shadow. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Enepe finally stopped in a small alcove where a spring trickled from a crack in the rock, feeding a shallow pool before vanishing into the sand like a magic trick. Both of them were gasping for breath, hearts hammering, sweat pouring down their faces despite the relative coolness. Cordelia sank to her knees beside the pool, her whole body shaking with the aftershocks of terror and exertion, and she felt hysterical laughter bubbling up in her throat. "I stabbed a man with a surveyor's pin." She said the words coming out half-strangled, and then she was laughing and crying, at the same time all the control she had been maintaining crumbling like a sandcastle at high tide. Enepe knelt beside her, his face grim, blood still running from the cut on his forehead. "Did you kill him?" "No, through the hand." She held up her own hand, seeing it shake, seeing the blood under her nails that wasn't hers. "I stabbed a man. I didn't think I could." "You did what you had to do." His voice was gentle but firm, the tone of someone who had killed before and made peace with it, or as much peace as anyone ever made with taking a life or causing pain. "You survived. That's what matters. He scooped water in his cupped hands and drank, and then offered his hands to her. She drank from them, an act of intimacy that felt both ancient and immediate, the water cold and mineral sharp tasting like the earth itself. When she lowered her head, she saw that Enepe was bleeding worse than she had realized. The cut on his forehead was deep, and blood was dripping from his chin onto his chest. "You're hurt." She reached toward the wound, then hesitated, suddenly aware that despite their claimed marriage, despite everything they had been through in the last 2 hours, they were still strangers. "May I?" He nodded, sitting still while she tore a strip from the hem of her already ruined dress and used water from the spring to clean the cut as gently as she could. Up close, she could see scars on his face and neck, old ones earned over years. A life lived hard and dangerous, written on his skin in white lines. "Thank you," she said softly as she worked dabbing at the wound, "for standing with me. You could have walked away at any point. Should have. This isn't your fight." Enepe was silent for a long moment, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he said, his voice low and careful, as if he were feeling his way through a dark room. "I had a sister, younger than me by 4 years. Pretty girl, smart, curious about everything. When the buffalo herds were slaughtered and our hunting grounds were taken by treaty, we never agreed till the missionaries came. They said they could feed us, educate us, teach us the white man's ways, so we could survive in this new world that was crushing us." He paused, and Cordelia stopped her ministrations, sensing that what was coming was important, that he was sharing something he rarely spoke of. "My sister went with them. She wanted to learn to read, to write, to understand the magic that let white men mark paper and make it mean things. They sent her to a school back east, a boarding school where they were supposed to civilize Indian children. They cut her hair, changed her name from Mahpia, which means sky, to Mary, forbade her to speak Cheyenne, to practice our ways, to remember who she was." His voice remained level, but Cordelia could hear the pain beneath it, old and deep and unhealed. "She died there after 8 months. Pneumonia, the letter said. But it also described a girl who had lost weight, who cried all the time, who refused to eat, who had stopped speaking altogether. They tried to make her forget her language, her name, her people, everything she was. And when she broke under that weight, when her spirit gave up and her body followed, they blamed her weakness instead of their cruelty. They said she wasn't strong enough to be civilized." Cordelia felt tears running down her face, and this time she didn't try to stop them. "I'm so sorry. There are no words. I'm so sorry. So when I see someone being crushed by power they didn't ask for and don't deserve, when I see someone being erased and sold and told they're not good enough or sane enough or civilized enough to control their own life, I think of Mapia." He looked at Cordelia directly, and his eyes were fierce. "I couldn't save her. Maybe I can help save you. Not from kindness, understand, though. I'm not unkind, but from something more selfish. From needing to see someone win against the system that grinds people down. From needing to believe that sometimes the fight matters." Cordelia finished tying off the makeshift bandage and sat back on her heels. "Your sister Mapia, she would be proud of you. Maybe. Or maybe she'd think I was a fool for risking my life for a stranger." His mouth twisted in something that wasn't quite a smile. "But I don't think I'm a fool. I think you're worth the risk. Those maps in your valise, they're not just your work. They're hope for people who have none. Water is life out here. You know where to find it, and men like Barrage want to control that knowledge so they can control everything else. That's worth fighting for. Even if it kills you. We all die. The question is whether we do it on our knees or on our feet." He stood, offering her his hand. "We need to keep moving. They'll regroup and come after us with more men. We need to reach Red Butte and find allies before Haskins can set another trap. Cordelia took his hand and let him pull her to her feet. But before he could release her, she held on, squeezing his fingers. "Can I tell you something? Something I've never told anyone?" "Yes." She took a shaking breath. "Every morning for 2 years, I would bind my breasts until I could barely breathe. Put on my father's old clothes that smelled like whiskey and failure. Lower my voice and shorten my stride and learn to spit and curse and be crude enough to fit in with the survey crews. And every night, I would lie alone in my tent and whisper my real name to myself, Cordelia, 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 reminding myself who I really was underneath the disguise." Her voice broke. "Some nights I wasn't sure anymore. Some nights I thought maybe I had become Cord, that Cordelia had been erased the way they erased your sister. Those were the worst nights. The nights when I understood a little of what Mahpia must have felt being told that everything you are is wrong, that you need to be remade into something acceptable." Enepe pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her, and she let herself lean into his strength. "But you didn't disappear," he said into her hair. "You're still here, still fighting, still Cordelia." "So are you," she whispered. "Still Enepe, still remembering Mahpia. We're both still here. Maybe that's enough. Maybe it is." They held each other for a long moment, two damaged people finding unexpected connection in shared pain and shared defiance. Then they separated, gathering their resolve, and continued deeper into the canyon. After an hour, the canyon opened into a broader valley, where juniper and pinyon pine clung to the slopes. A small herd of horses grazed in the meadow grass, and Enepe explained these were animals he had been gentling for a local rancher. He borrowed 2, a sturdy buckskin and a gray mare, fashioning rope bridles with quick efficiency. They rode through the afternoon and into evening, following trails that Enepe navigated by instinct, heading toward Red Butte by a circuitous route. As darkness fell, they approached the town from the north, dismounting behind a sawmill and moving on foot through back alleys. Dr. Cora Bell's cottage was dark, except for a single lamp burning in the window. Enepe knocked 2 raps, paused 1 rap, and the door opened immediately. A woman in her 40s with gray hair and sharp eyes looked them over and stepped aside without a word. "Inside, quickly. Half the town is looking for you." They entered and told her everything. Cora listened gravely, then explained that they needed to prove the guardianship was fraudulent before the circuit judge arrived the next day. She suggested enlisting Adeline Brooks, the schoolteacher, who kept meticulous land records. But before they could formulate a plan, a commotion erupted outside, shouting, running feet, the smell of smoke. Cordelia looked out the window and saw flames rising from the direction of the schoolhouse. "Haskins," Enepe said grimly. "He's burning the school to flush us out or to destroy Adeline's records." Before they could react, the back door exploded inward, and Haskins burst through with 2 hired guns, weapons drawn. "Found you. Don't move or I'll kill you where you stand." They were marched at gunpoint into the street, where a crowd had gathered to fight the fire consuming the schoolhouse. In the chaos and the firelight, Cordelia saw Ephraim Pike, the farmer with the dry well, stop what he was doing and stare at her. Their eyes met. Something shifted in his face. He set down his buckets and walked toward Haskins with terrible determination. "Let them go," he said, his voice carrying over the crowd noise. "Get back, Pike, or you'll be arrested too." "No." Ephraim's hands shook, but his voice was steady. "I'm done being afraid. Barrage came to me 3 days ago, offered to restore my well if I watched Miss Hirsch and reported where she went. I said yes because my children are sick and I was desperate. But this burning down our children's school, this is too much. I won't be part of it anymore. He turned to address the crowd, his voice rising. Berridge filed false land claims under Otto Hirsch's name on the same land where Cordelia's maps show water. He bragged to me about it. Said soon he'd own every drop of water in the territory, and we'd all come begging. The crowd murmured, angry and uncertain. Haskins fired his revolver into the air, trying to regain control. Everyone disperse, this is official business. But the shot had the opposite effect. People began closing in, forming a circle around Haskins and his men. The balance had shifted. Into this tense moment strode Adeline Brooks, her face covered in soot, her dress singed, carrying her precious ledger. She walked straight up to Haskins and slapped him across the face with her free hand. "You burned my school," she said, voice shaking with fury. "You burned where children learn to read. You burned hope." Before Haskins could retaliate, Enepe grabbed the deputy's wrist and twisted, applying pressure that made Haskins cry out and drop his weapon. The crowd surged forward, disarming the hired guns. In seconds, the tables had turned. A new voice cut through the chaos. "Everyone stand down." Judge Harlan appeared, a severe man in his 60s, wearing a black suit despite the heat. He had arrived early on an unscheduled freight wagon, summoned by telegraph reporting unrest. "I will hold an emergency hearing at dawn at the depot," he announced. "Anyone with testimony is welcome, but for now disperse. Save what you can of this building." Haskins and his men were marched to the jail by armed citizens. The crowd slowly broke up, some fighting the fire, others spreading the word. Judge Harlan led Cordelia Enepe, Dr. Cora, and Adeline to the depot to hear their full account. They spent the remainder of the night there, presenting evidence: the letter Cordelia had stolen from Otto, outlining the conspiracy, Adeline's ledger showing false land claims filed in Otto's name, testimony from Ephraim about Berridge's bribes and threats. Otto Hirsch himself was found drunk in the saloon and brought to testify. As dawn broke, Elias Berridge arrived with 6 hired guns flanking him. He was a tall man in his 50s, well-dressed with cold blue eyes. His presence brought immediate tension. Judge Harlan established his makeshift court on the depot platform, using crates for furniture. The hearing began as townspeople gathered to watch. Cordelia presented her evidence, supported by testimony from Cora, Adeline, and Ephraim. Otto, under the judge's stern questioning, finally broke down and admitted the truth that Berridge had offered to forgive his debts in exchange for Cordelia, and the maps that the guardianship was a scheme to control her property. Judge Harlan studied all the evidence carefully, then rendered his verdict. The guardianship petition is denied. Cordelia Hirsch is declared a competent adult. Furthermore, the land claims filed in Otto Hirsch's name are declared fraudulent and void. The land reverts to public domain. Cordelia felt relief flood through her. But Berridge's face had gone from red to white, his jaw clenching. This was his empire crumbling, years of schemes collapsing. "This is outrageous," he shouted. "I'll appeal to Santa Fe. I'll have you removed from the bench." "You are welcome to try," Judge Harlan said coldly. "But I suggest you leave Red Butte before these citizens decide to take justice into their own hands." Berridge looked at the crowd, saw the anger there, the barely restrained fury, and seemed to calculate his options. For a moment, Cordelia thought he would accept defeat and ride away. Then his face twisted with rage and desperation. A man who had built everything on power and control, now watching it slip away, could not simply surrender. "To hell with this," Berridge snarled. His hand dropped to the revolver under his coat. "If I can't have those maps, nobody will. Kill them all." His 6 hired guns drew their weapons in a coordinated movement, rifles and revolvers coming up to aim at Judge Harlan, at Cordelia, at Enepe, and the witnesses on the platform. The crowd gasped and scattered. This was it, the moment when desperation turned to slaughter. But Enepe had been watching Berridge's face, had seen the shift from calculation to murderous resolve. And he moved faster than thought. His Spencer carbine came up, and he fired point blank at the nearest gunman, the heavy slug catching the man in the chest and throwing him backward off his feet. The sharp crack of the Spencer was immediately followed by chaos. Cordelia dropped flat on the platform, rolling behind a crate as bullets began flying. Judge Harlan dove for cover. Adeline pulled Cora down behind the freight wagon. The townspeople who had scattered now surged back, many of them armed, and the depot platform became a battlefield. 2 of Berridge's men turned their rifles on the crowd. But Ephraim Pike, still carrying the axe handle he'd been using to fight the schoolhouse fire, swung it like a club and caught one gunman across the back of the head. The man went down in a heap. Ephraim grabbed the fallen rifle and turned it on the second gunman, his face set in grim determination. Drop it or die. The gunman dropped his weapon. Enepe had already levered another round into his Spencer and fired again, this time at a hired gun who was drawing a bead on Cordelia's hiding place. The bullet struck the man's shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol clattering across the platform boards. The gunman clutched his bleeding shoulder and stumbled away into the crowd, where rough hands seized him. Berridge himself had drawn his revolver and was aiming at Judge Harlan. If he couldn't escape justice, he would kill the judge and create enough chaos to flee in the confusion. But Cordelia saw his intent. Without thinking, acting on pure protective instinct for the man who had given her freedom, she lunged from behind her crate and grabbed Berridge's arm, throwing off his aim. The shot went wild, punching a hole in the depot roof. Berridge backhanded her savagely, the blow catching her across the temple and sending her sprawling. Stars exploded in her vision. She heard Enepe roar with fury, a sound more animal than human. And then he was on Berridge, tackling the cattle baron to the platform with bone-jarring force. They grappled, rolling each, trying to control Berridge's revolver. The weapon was between them, muzzle pointing up, both men's hands wrapped around it. Berridge was larger, heavier, but Enepe fought with the skill of someone who had survived countless battles. He hooked his leg behind Berridge's knee and twisted, using leverage to slam the bigger man onto his back. The revolver fired the bullet, going straight up into the air. The concussion was deafening this close. Enepe used Berridge's moment of distraction to wrench the weapon free and throw it away. Then drove his fist into the cattle baron's face, once, twice, 3 times, with methodical precision. Berridge's nose shattered with a wet crunch. Blood poured down his face. "You're done," Enepe said through clenched teeth, his voice raw. "Finished. You'll never hurt anyone again." But Berridge, even beaten, was not surrendering. He pulled a knife from his boot, a last desperate weapon, and slashed at Enepe's throat. Only Enepe's combat reflexes saved him. He jerked back and the blade missed his jugular by inches, instead opening a long, shallow cut across his collarbone. Before Berridge could strike again, Ephraim Pike was there, pressing the muzzle of the captured rifle against Berridge's temple. "Drop the knife, or I paint the platform with your brains." The cold certainty in Ephraim's voice left no room for doubt. This farmer, this desperate father, had found a line he would not allow anyone to cross. Berridge, staring into eyes that promised death, finally let the knife fall from his fingers. "It's over," Ephraim said. "Finished." The remaining gunmen, seeing their employer defeated and outnumbered, threw down their weapons and raised their hands. The townspeople, led by the livery owner and several farmers, quickly surrounded them and bound their hands with rope. Within minutes, the would-be massacre had been stopped, and the aggressors were prisoners. Judge Harlan emerged from cover, his face pale but his bearing dignified. He surveyed the scene, 2 dead gunmen, 1 wounded Berridge, beaten and bleeding on the platform, the rest surrendered. "Haskins," he called. "Where is Deputy Haskins?" "Still in the jail cell where we put him last night, Your Honor," someone called back. "Good." He stays there. He's under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, arson, and attempted murder. The judge turned his severe gaze on Berridge. As for you, Mr. Berridge, you just attempted to murder a federal judge and multiple witnesses in front of half the town. You will be transported to Santa Fe for trial on charges of fraud, conspiracy, corruption, of public officials, arson, and attempted murder. I expect you will hang. Berridge spat blood. I'm a wealthy man. I have connections. I'll never see a rope. Your wealth just bought you hired killers who failed. Your connections mean nothing here. Justice will be served. Judge Harlan gestured to the townspeople. Lock him with Haskins. Post guards. No one gets near them without my explicit permission. Berridge was hauled to his feet and dragged away, still snarling threats, but they were empty now, the ravings of a defeated man. The surviving gunmen were marched to the jail as well, their weapons confiscated and distributed among the townspeople for guards. Cordelia had struggled to her feet, her head ringing from Berridge's blow. Enepe came to her immediately, blood running from the cut across his collarbone, but his eyes fierce with concern. Are you hurt? I'll be fine. You're bleeding? It's shallow. I've had worse. He pulled her close, one arm around her waist, and for a moment, they just stood together, breathing hard, the aftermath of violence making them both shake. You saved the judge. That was incredibly brave and incredibly foolish. I wasn't thinking. I saw him aiming and I moved. She looked up at him. You called me brave. I feel anything but. Bravery is being terrified and acting anyway. That's what you did. He touched her face gently, checking the bruise forming where Berridge had struck her. We're quite a pair. Both bleeding, both half crazy, both too stubborn to quit. Despite everything, she laughed. Yes, quite a pair. Judge Harlan approached them, his expression softer than before. You showed remarkable courage. Both of you. This territory needs more people willing to stand against tyranny. He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. Miss Hirsch, your marriage to Enepe began as a legal expedient. But having witnessed how you fight together, how you protect each other, I believe it has become something more. If you wish, I can perform a proper ceremony this afternoon, making it official beyond any question. Cordelia looked at Enepe, seeing the question in his eyes and the same question that was in her heart. They had been through fire together, literally and figuratively. They had shared pain and hope and desperate violence. They had saved each other's lives. What were they now? What did they want to be? Yes, she said, the word coming out strong and certain. I want that. Not because the law requires it, but because I choose it. I choose you, Enepe. I choose to build a life with you. Enepe's face transformed, the hard lines softening into something that might have been joy. And I choose you. Not because you need rescue, but because you're strong and brave, and you see the world the way I do as something worth fighting for. You're my partner, Cordelia, in every way that matters. He kissed her, then gentle despite the violence they had just survived, and the crowd erupted in cheers and applause. When they broke apart, both were smiling through tears and exhaustion. The ceremony was held that afternoon in front of Dr. Cora's cottage, which had survived the night's chaos. Judge Harlan performed the rites, speaking the traditional words, while Cordelia and Enepe held hands and made promises to each other that went far beyond the legal formulas. They promised partnership, respect, shared struggle, and shared joy. They promised to face whatever came together as equals. Ephraim Pike stood as witness, along with Dr. Cora and Miss Adeline. Otto Hirsch was not present. He had left town at first light, slipping away in shame and disgrace, leaving behind nothing but debts and bitter memories. No one mourned his departure. That evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, Cordelia and Enipe rode out to the cottonwood grove where the spring flowed constant and cool. They sat together on the bank, their hands intertwined, speaking of the future. "What will you do now?" Enipe asked. "I received a letter from the Territorial Survey Office last week before everything went to hell. They offered me a 2-year contract to map the country from here to the Colorado line." She showed him the letter. "They require my husband's consent for dangerous field work, some liability policy. Will you give it?" "Only if I come with you." His voice was firm. "We're partners. We work together. That's the foundation we're building on." "Yes," she said, smiling. Together, the weeks that followed were ones of rebuilding and renewal. Berridge and Haskins were tried in Santa Fe. Berridge was convicted of fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder of a federal judge, and corruption. He was sentenced to hang, and the sentence was carried out 3 months later. Haskins received 20 years in federal prison. The hired guns who had survived were given lesser sentences in exchange for testimony. Otto Hirsch was never seen in New Mexico territory again. Rumors placed him in California, then Texas, always drifting, always running from the shame of what he had done to his daughter. Cordelia did not search for him. She had made her peace with his absence. Cordelia and Adeline spent 2 weeks carefully copying the survey maps, making dozens of sets. They distributed them to every farmer, every homesteader, every family that needed water. The knowledge that had been hoarded became shared, and within 3 months, 17 new wells had been sunk on public land. The territory began to transform from dust bowl to viable farmland. Ephraim Pike was one of the first to benefit. Cordelia personally helped him locate the best site for a well on his claim, and when water rose cool and clear from the shaft, the entire Pike family wept with relief. His children recovered their health. His wife smiled again. He named the well Freedom Spring after the courage it had taken to stand up against Berridge. Red Butte itself prospered quietly. The schoolhouse was rebuilt in 6 weeks through community effort, everyone contributing labor and materials. It was made larger than before, with a reading room and proper desks for every child. Adeline resumed teaching with renewed vigor, and her students learned not just arithmetic and reading, but the importance of standing up for justice, even when it was dangerous. Cordelia and Enipe began their survey work that autumn, mapping the territory together. They were a formidable team, her technical knowledge combined with his understanding of the land, his ability to read terrain and find water sources that she would then measure and document with precision. The Territorial Survey Office was so impressed with their first reports that they extended the contract to 5 years. They lived a nomadic life, moving from site to site, with the seasons camping under the vast New Mexico sky. It was hard work, sometimes dangerous, but deeply satisfying. They were creating something lasting, maps that would help generations of settlers find water and build lives in this harsh but beautiful country. In the spring of 1874, Cordelia discovered she was pregnant. They were camped by a stream in the foothills when she told Enipe, and his joy was so complete, so unguarded, that it made her cry. They decided to continue working through the summer, then return to Red Butte for the birth. Their daughter was born in March of 1875, delivered by Dr. Cora in the same cottage where Cordelia and Enipe had found sanctuary on that desperate night. The baby was healthy, with her mother's auburn hair and her father's dark eyes. They named her Rain because water was life and hope and the future. Rain grew up learning to read survey maps before she could read books to ride, before she could run properly to measure angles and calculate depths alongside her mother, while her father taught her to read the land by its stones and plants, the behavior of animals. She absorbed both cultures, her mother's scientific approach and her father's traditional knowledge, and became something new, something uniquely herself. The years passed. Cordelia and Enepe completed their 5-year survey contract and were immediately offered another. They accepted but modified the terms. They would work only 6 months of the year, spending the other 6 in Red Butte, where Rain could attend school with Adeline's other students. It was a compromise that satisfied everyone. Red Butte grew from a struggling frontier settlement into a thriving small town. The reliable water from the wells Cordelia had mapped attracted more settlers: farmers, ranchers, craftspeople, teachers. A proper church was built then, a second school. The town became known throughout the territory as a place where knowledge was valued, where water was shared, rather than hoarded, where justice meant something. Ephraim Pike became the town's mayor, serving 3 terms. He never forgot the debt he owed Cordelia and Enepe, and he made certain that Red Butte remained a place where courage and integrity mattered more than wealth or power. Adeline Brooks lived to be 91, teaching children for 43 years. When she finally retired, her former students established a scholarship in her name for young women who wanted to pursue education or scientific careers. Cordelia was the first contributor. Dr. Cora Bell trained 3 apprentices to continue her work, including Rain, who showed an early aptitude for healing and became a respected physician herself. Treating both settlers and the native peoples who still moved through the territory, building bridges between communities that had too often been at war. Cordelia and Enepe worked as surveyors and waterfinders for 27 years until their bodies could no longer handle the rigors of constant travel. They had mapped over 15,000 square miles of territory, located hundreds of viable well sites, and helped thousands of families establish successful homesteads. Their maps were considered the finest ever produced of the region and were used by settlers, the government, and railroad companies for decades. When they finally retired, they built a small house on the outskirts of Red Butte near the Cottonwood Grove, where the springs still flowed constant and cool. They spent their later years there writing detailed memoirs of their survey work, teaching occasional classes at the school, and doting on their 3 grandchildren. Rain had married a surveyor she met through her parents, and the family tradition continued into another generation. On a summer evening in 1903, when Cordelia was 74 and Enepe was nearly 80, they sat together on the porch of their house and watched the sun set over the mesa. Cordelia's hands were twisted with arthritis, too stiff to draw straight lines anymore. Enepe's hair was white as snow, and he moved slowly, his joints protesting the decades of hard living. But they were still together, still partners, still deeply in love, with the kind of love that had been earned through shared struggle and built through shared joy. "Tell me again how we met," their youngest granddaughter asked. She was 10 years old and endlessly curious about family history. Cordelia smiled. "I married your grandfather to escape being sold like property. It was an act of desperation, a legal trick. I grabbed his arm in a moment of pure terror and claimed him as my husband, so my father couldn't control me anymore." "That doesn't sound very romantic," the girl said, wrinkling her nose. "It wasn't," Enepe agreed, his voice rough with age, but still warm. "Romance came later. It grew slowly like a cottonwood tree from a seed, putting down roots through hard work, through facing danger together, through learning to trust completely. That kind of love is stronger than the lightning strike kind. It has foundations." "Were you scared?" the girl asked. "Terrified," Cordelia admitted. "Every day for months, I was terrified. Terrified of being caught, of being forced back under my father's control, of losing the work I had done and the knowledge I had gained. Terrified of failing the people who depended on those maps." "But you weren't terrified of him." The girl pointed at Enepe. "No. From the moment he stood between me and the guns, from the moment he said, 'She stays with me,' I knew he was someone I could trust. Cordelia reached over and took Ennepe's gnarled hand, their fingers interlacing with the practiced ease of decades. I knew he saw me as a person, not property, as a partner, not a subordinate. That made all the difference. Ennepe squeezed her hand gently. She was the bravest person I ever met. Stabbed a man with a surveyor's pin when he came at her with a knife. Threw herself at a cattle baron to save a judge. Never backed down, never surrendered, even when the odds were terrible. How could I not fall in love with someone like that? And he stood up to 4 armed men for a woman he'd just met, Cordelia added. Risked his life over and over to protect me and the knowledge that could help people. He shared his grief about Mahpia and let me share mine about losing myself while pretending to be Cord. He made me feel seen in ways I'd never been seen before. The granddaughter was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she asked, "What was the best part of your whole life together?" Cordelia and Ennepe looked at each other, and in their eyes was the accumulated weight of 30 years of marriage, of thousands of miles traveled together, of dangers faced and overcome, of quiet mornings and passionate nights, of arguments and reconciliations, of work completed and children raised. The weight of a life fully lived. The best part, Cordelia said slowly, was waking up every morning knowing I had a partner. Someone who saw me as I truly was and loved me not despite my stubbornness and ambition, but because of them. Someone who treated me as an equal when the law said I was less. That was freedom. Not the absence of constraint, but the presence of true partnership. The best part, Ennepe echoed, was knowing that my life mattered. That the choice I made on that hot afternoon to stand beside a stranger changed lives, hers, mine, and hundreds of others. That Mahpia's death was not meaningless if it taught me to stand up for those being crushed by systems they couldn't control. The best part was earning love instead of demanding it, building it through actions instead of words. The granddaughter nodded solemnly, storing this wisdom away. She would remember it years later, when she faced her own challenges, made her own choices about whom to trust and how to live. As the sun finally set and the first stars emerged, Cordelia leaned her head against Ennepe's shoulder. "We did well," she said softly. "Didn't we?" "We did better than well." His arm came around her, holding her close. "We built something real, something lasting. Water still flows from the wells we found. Children still learn from maps we drew. Our daughter heals the sick. Our grandchildren will carry on the work. That's a legacy worth having. Do you have any regrets?" He considered the question seriously. "I regret that Mahpia never got to meet you. She would have loved you, would have been inspired by you. I regret that I couldn't reconcile with my father before he died. That he never apologized, never made amends. That bitterness is the only legacy he left me. Then we'll make certain our legacy is different. Love instead of bitterness. Partnership instead of control. Knowledge shared instead of hoarded." "Yes," Cordelia agreed. "That's what we'll leave behind." They sat together in the gathering darkness, two people who had started as desperate strangers and become something far greater. Partners, lovers, best friends, colleagues, parents, grandparents. Two people who had claimed each other in a moment of crisis, and then spent 3 decades proving that the claim was real, was earned, was worthy. Cordelia had become a Cheyenne warrior's wife to escape her father. And in return, Ennepe had become her freedom. Not by rescuing her, but by standing beside her as an equal. By respecting her strength, by building with her a life based on mutual choice rather than legal obligation or social expectation. It was not the love of fairy tales born from a kiss or glance. It was better the love of partners who had faced fire together and emerged stronger, who had built something lasting in a harsh land, who had created freedom, not by fleeing constraints, but by redefining what relationship could mean. As the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Cordelia and Enipe sat together, their hands clasped, their hearts at peace, knowing they had lived well and loved truly. And in Red Butte, the waters still flowed from Freedom Spring, cool and constant, a testament to courage and partnership, and the enduring power of knowledge shared freely.